do? Listen to you. Nope, went to see my sister in North Carolina. Raleigh. Terry was there visiting her 2 kids and the 3 grandkids. Terry's 2 daughters do. Terry lives in Kansas, but no, she and her husband live in Kansas now. So they did. Yeah, they moved, what, about a year ago? 18 months ago, something like that. Greg's from Kansas, so he built a house on, I guess his grandmother had a big farm, so he got 40 of those acres and built a house. But Greg, Terry's husband. Craig is in Birmingham now. Yeah. Everybody's moving away. Sad. Well, there you go. I repeat, sad. Andy, can you lead us in the prayer? Any announcements? Tim and Denise have made it successfully to New Mexico, so I assume that means their son graduated successfully. They're going later. Okay. Gotcha. So son is still in progress of graduating. Remember Dan and Janet as they travel. And George is traveling as well. George Grady, making his journey. Okay. A lot of travelers. Any update on Lonnie? Sounded like it was going pretty well. No. Anybody else? Andy, can you lead us in a word of prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the joy of running your domain and having a world so suitable for life, living in a pleasant country and having a freedom and having a peace.
So we're going to continue kind of our look at the Apostle John. Just kind of a little bit about what kind of made him unique. We studied last week that one of the unique things about John and the other apostles, was just kind of how they were viewed by the educated Jews. I'll repeat one of the things I found that I thought was pretty telling. This has been passed down through secular history, but one of the sayings of the rabbis is for the people of Galilee: do not commit testimony to them, accept no testimony from them. Do not reveal a secret to them. Do not appoint them as guardians for orphans. Do not appoint them stewards over charities, and do not join their company on the road. So, Jesus picked from this lot of people that clearly were not going to be well accepted by the ruling Jews. And so it's kind of interesting that, a large percentage of Jesus' time obviously was spent in Galilee. His apostles were majority drawn from the people of Galilee. And, in that group, there was, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And we know that they were fishermen. We spent a little bit of time last week that a number of the commentators, and I have to admit I kind of agree with them, believe that the two disciples who were following John the Baptist, one of them was named. It was Andrew. The other one was most likely John. And so they were the two that, when they were following John the Baptist, Jesus came along, and they went to Jesus' abode and spent time with Jesus. And then they returned to their profession, as we talked about last week. So John clearly has, as well as Andrew, taken on kind of a view of what it means to be a disciple. They went to follow John the Baptist. They quickly accepted Jesus and went to his home or his place of dwelling. And then when Jesus called them, as we talked about before, they quickly left their fishing village and followed Jesus. We know they spent three and a half years with Jesus as he was preaching during his ministry. And we know that John became part of the inner circle. It was James, John, and Peter were the inner circle. They had unique experiences with Jesus. They, like I said last week, 4 of them that I specifically noticed was raising of Jairus' daughter, the Transfiguration, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives. I'm sure there are probably others, but those are the 4 that clearly, they were, for lack of a better word, they were with Jesus alone in very, very special times. They had a very steep learning curve to come up. So how did Jesus name James and John? He gave them a name. And yeah, Andy even knows is that Greek? Yeah, okay, there you go. But the sons of thunder. And, the Bible's got numerous references to thunder, and it's volatile. It's angry. It's destructive. And that's who they were. I mean, we have the apostles, and particularly these 2 men, have unique situations. They're leaving Samaria where a town didn't accept Jesus. What did James and John want to do? Andy? They wanted to destroy it. They wanted to call down fire and brimstone, much like Elijah had. So they had a precedent for this, but they had a way of dealing with people who didn't meet their expectation. He also had a little conversation with Jesus about getting preferential treatment. In fact, they sicked Mom on her. So Mom asked, can one sit on my right hand and one on the left hand? So you don't get the picture of James and John as being kind of people who sat in the background. You don't get the sense that they were people who just kind of went along to get along. They weren't your quiet, unassuming 2 men. John was most likely the younger of the 2 because he's always mentioned second, and just based on biblical history and the writings at the time, that's almost a positive indicator that he was the youngest. We know that John had a unique relationship with Jesus, beyond what the other two had, Peter and James. Yeah, and we know that mostly from John's writings, but there are numerous things. But John's writing of the gospel is very different than the other three, and we've always discussed that as we grew up. But I think the difference is much more profound than sometimes we're taught. The other three give you a chronological journey of Jesus' life. John doesn't. John's was written later. In fact, all four of John's books were written late. And he's not trying to do anything other than explain to you the things that had an impact on him. What did Jesus teach him? And that's how he tells his story. John's not terribly interested in making sure he's in alignment with the other three Gospels on timing. He's not telling the same stories. He's got a message that he wants to get out to the Christians of the time. And his message is, this is what Jesus taught me. This is what I learned from Jesus. And I'm writing it so you can understand what a profound effect he had on me. And that's really how he writes. And he's the one that when we ended last week, he talked about, how he and James followed Jesus. But he's also the one of the four Gospels that writes about how that comes full circle. How Jesus appears to them and tells them to go fishing again. And how they determined it was Jesus even though they couldn't see it was Jesus. Jesus had risen from the dead, and John wants to make sure everyone understands that it goes to a complete circle. Jesus called us out of the boat, and he came to us again after he rose from the dead to come out of the boat. Both times there was a miraculous haul of fish, and both times we followed Jesus. So John has a unique perspective. He also is the only writer who really gives us a perspective, and it's around a couple of events in the Bible. So turn to John chapter 6. And this is after the miraculous feeding. And once again, you get the sense that John tells things that happened with Jesus because they had a profound effect on him. And this is where, it's after they've spent all the time with Jesus and Jesus snuck away from them. So starting in verse 26. Well, I'm starting in verse 25. So Jesus has fed the 5,000 and he's walked on water. And now they found him again. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked, Rabbi, when did you get here? I tell you the truth, you were looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate of the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then they ask him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in him, in the one he has sent. So they ask him, what miraculous signs will you give that we may see and believe you? What will you do? Our forefathers ate manna in the desert, as is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And obviously John captures us, and we'll keep on with this. But it's almost like John's looking back and kind of is a little incredulous about this conversation. Okay? Jesus has fed 5,000 people with nothing. Jesus has walked on water. And John's like, okay, we finally caught up with him again, and what's our first response? Well, show us a miracle. John's like, yeah, we weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. Of the things that we could have said, this really wasn't high on the list of things we probably should have said. Jesus is sitting there looking at him going, what more do you want from me? Are you following me because of my miracles? That's not the reason you should be following me. I just told you the reason you should follow me is because I'm from God. And so John is the only one who kind of captures this for us. And then he moves, if you go down to verse 53, he talks about how that conversation that Jesus has goes on and on. And the result is many of the disciples leaving. He captures that in verses 60 and following. But then in verses 53 through 68, 53 through 68, I'm sorry. But starting in verse 61. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about what Jesus had said, he asked, does this offend you? What if you see the Son of God ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. From this time, many of the disciples turned their back and no longer followed him. Jesus asked of the 12, do you not want to leave too? Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. Then Jesus said, have I not chosen you the 12? Yet one of you is the devil. So it's interesting that this is something that John decides to share. This is a turning point in Jesus' ministry. Up until this time, he has plenty of people following him. He has plenty of people who are intrigued by who he is. But very few people believe he's the Son of God. Very few people believe he is the Messiah. They leave. They like the free food and they like the tricks. You know, he can turn water to wine. He can feed us when we're hungry. We don't really have to work. We can just follow him around and we'll be taken care of. And Jesus quickly dissuades them of that's going to happen. He just tells them, look, I came to be the Messiah. And it's almost like the 12 are finally starting to understand that what we thought of the Messiah is not what we're going to get. We're not getting the 2,000-year reign. We're not getting the earthly kingdom. Mom's request of sitting on the right hand and the left hand's not going to be really what we thought it was going to be. And Peter's response, which John records for us, is interesting. I never really focused on it, but I never really focused on the fact that John what it really tells us is, where would we go? Where do we go? Okay? You're not who you said you were going to be. You're not who we thought you were going to be. But where are we going to go? We believe you're the Son of God, but you're not taking us on the journey that we thought we were going to be on. And for John, and this is Jeff kind of interpreting this, it's finally this is kind of a turning point for him. It's not what he thought it was. This is not what he was expecting from a Messiah. Now, once again, James and John would be perfect for an earthly king. You can have the infantry, you can have the cavalry. They would be perfect. That fit their role. That's who they were. They wanted to go destroy people. Give me troops, give me miraculous powers, and off we'll go. The Romans will be no more. But it's starting to twig on that that's not what this is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, when I was young, we were just taught kind of the standard, well, when you write the fourth gospel, you don't make it like the three, because what's the point? But it goes beyond that. When we did our first reading through here starting in January, the Bible reading plan, I started marking everywhere in the Gospel of John that indicates that what happened at the time, or what was said by Jesus at the time, was
when you read John, I think, as Clark said, you get kind of the progression of John in particular. Things changed. And these are the things that really had an impact on John. Like Clark said, he wasn't trying to tell you, here's how Jesus 3.5 years went. Here's what was impactful to me. Here's what made Jesus resonate with me. And I think it's important to understand who this is resonating to. He's not Mark. He's not Matthew. He's not Luke. He's not Peter. He's very, very different. He then does something that's very unique, and he focuses on it almost like he wants to beat us over the head about it, but he breaks it up so that sometimes I think we miss it. So Jesus is coming towards the end of his days. So if you turn to John chapter 13, he does this 3 times in very short order. So John 13, Julie, read verses 33 through 35, please. Okay, Andy, flip over to John chapter 15, verses 10 through 12. All right, and then to kind of close out the section, it's in verse 17 of chapter 15. This is my command. Love each other. So John, more so than any other gospel writer, wants you to understand one real basic principle. The thing that makes Christianity different was Christ. If you don't get anything else out of my writing, understand. The thing that's going to set you apart is your love. It all started with John. If you can't get past that, don't start. That is the thing that makes it essential to being a Christian. If you don't understand this, don't go on the journey. Because of all the things that Christ taught us, this is what he taught us. He taught us what love meant. And John clearly, it's as we get into his writings of his 3 letters, he's going to spend a lot of time on it. But it's funny because if there's one verse that just the casual Christian will know, what is it? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Anybody who knows anything about being a Christian knows that verse. And John follows it up, as we're going to study in 1 John as well. He captures the essence that he wants you to understand. And then he proceeds to beat you about the head and shoulders with it, just so you don't lose it. And it's what I find so refreshing about John, is he's not Paul. His writings aren't complicated. He doesn't try and overwhelm you with gospel and with theory and with, dense preaching and try and write complicated letters. That's not who John is. He wants you to understand what the essence of being a Christian is. And in all of his writings, he starts with one basic principle, and it centers around John 3:16. And he just continues to repeat it. And he repeats it in areas that probably we would, as we read it in a chronological order, especially the gospel, we miss it because he repeats it so often. And then, as you look at John, the readings that Julie and Andy did, happened right after what? What had Jesus just done? Wash their feet. Yeah, you got these guys who are kind of, let's just say they were a little rough. Yeah, these aren't gentle souls who are his 12 apostles. These are not the meek that are going to inherit the earth. But Jesus has sat down and washed their feet. You know, and I read the commentaries, and I agree with them. Ain't a lot of people lining up to wash James and John's feet. Okay, it hasn't been a part of their culture. Nobody has sat around and washed their feet, and it has a profound effect. And for John, he then, in very short order, talks about what that means to him and what that represents to him. And I think that's what I really appreciate about John's writing is he is very heartfelt and about how this man affected him, more so than the other writers. He's not trying to give you Jewish history. He's not trying to give you chronological history. He just wants you to understand what this man did to him. Okay.
Yeah, and once again, the two passages that were read are two that I marked as they didn't understand this at the time because, love one another is not a new commandment except that he's saying, love as I have loved you, and then he jumps ahead about the greatest love is to lay down your life for your brother. I think they understood at the time what that means. I don't think they understood that he was laying down his life for them. But afterwards, they look back and say, oh, that's how much he loved me. And then it starts to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then John says, I'm going to write about that.
Yeah, and then John also was fascinated with Jesus' breaking of tradition. So he's the one that tells us about Jesus going in and having that long conversation with the Samaritan woman. Yeah. And once again, I think all of us have studied that. That broke all kinds of rules. As far as John was concerned, well, this can't be. There's nothing that says this is allowed. Not only was she a Samaritan, she was in adultery, and she was a woman. I think we pass over that. If you're John, you don't pass over any of those three things. They're not things you pass over. And so, once again, John's looking back going, man, just how unique was that? And then as they're going to move out of Galilee and through Samaria, John's going to come to face with now a comparison of Jesus to the people who had taught him about being a Jew and the shocking difference that's going to be between the two. We had the people that taught us what it was to be a Jew, and then we had the Messiah. These two don't fit. They just don't fit. There's nothing that is compatible about what the Pharisees taught and who Jesus was. They're not any close, they're not even part of reality. So John captures that for us, and he also captures, the woman caught in adultery, which is, once again, the same thing. These are things that clearly for John made an impression. They were just so different. We know what his major flaws were, but the things that made John unique, I think I just tried to capture them, and then we're going to get a little bit into kind of how he progressed. He didn't run. When Jesus was taken, he didn't run. He was in the courtyard. He's the one that got Peter in the courtyard. Very unique. The other 10 are gone. The others are gone. He was at the cross. Nobody else was there of the apostles, just John. He clearly has changed, because if we go to John chapter 19, verses 25 to 27, it's Jesus at the cross, and it says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Dear woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From this time on, the disciple took her into his home. That's the complete transformation of John. Okay? Jesus has come to view this man as who he's going to entrust his family to. Nobody else, just John. John is the one who Jesus turns to and says, "Please take care of my mom. You know, I'm going back to my father, but I left my mom here behind. Please take care of her." And then, we see the other transformation of John when, if you look at the founding of the New Testament church from Pentecost forward, it's interesting, but the disciple whom Jesus loved is a part of the group that's established the church in Jerusalem. But he's not the take charge guy. He's not even one of the top two. He's there. Once again, he's changed. The two people who make decisions in the Jerusalem church are James, Jesus' brother, and Peter. John's there, but very much in the background. Think how different that is. This is a guy who wanted to burn a city. And this is a guy that wanted to sit on Jesus' right or his left hand. This isn't the son of thunder anymore. He's accepted his role. And he's clearly moved aside for Peter, in particular of the 12. He doesn't have to be the center of attention anymore. So, for me, when you look at John, especially through the writing of the gospel, you see a man who starts out one way and then wants you to understand what caused him to change. And that's why he wrote John. I want you to know what caused me to be a different man. There were things that happened in those 3.5 years that impacted me in a way that I was a completely changed man. And then if you go and look at biblical history, it's interesting. So the first part of the establishment of the New Testament church in Jerusalem is, as we said, kind of dominated by Peter. Peter's the guy who is going to be the lead man in establishing the New Testament church in Jerusalem. He's the spokesman at Pentecost. He's involved in pretty much all the major things that are going on there. The second stage of the Christian church is dominated by Paul. Paul's the one who's going to take the gospel to the world, especially the Gentile world. And it's going to be the major focus of the New Testament church growing. And that's directed by Paul. He's got helpers, and he's got Barnabas, he's got Silas, but it's directed by Paul. But when we look at the person who writes the history of the church, in retrospect, after Peter and Paul are gone, it's John. John tries to summarize for everybody, many years later, what is the essence of Christianity. All 4 of his books are written well after everyone else. And he's the old guy. He's the guy that outlasted everybody. And he has a message. And his message is really simple. For the guy who outlived everyone, his message is not complicated. And that's what I guess probably why John has always kind of resonated. He doesn't make it hard. You have a responsibility. You don't come into this church building with the question of, how's this church going to help me? You come into this church building saying, how can I help my fellow Christian? It's always been one of my, I got to admit, one of my pet peeves with people who come to church. What are y'all going to do to help me? I think you kind of, we'll spend some time on this, but I kind of think you missed the point. You What are you going to add to this church? What are you going to roll up your sleeves and do? How are you going to make this body stronger? How are we going to make our body a product of all of us as opposed to each of us individually being served? And John wants you to understand that. He wants you to understand that at its basic core. He wants us to walk through that door going, what can I do to build up my brother and sister today? And he doesn't make it any more complicated than that. He wants that to be your focus. So I've never, I got to admit, and I'll be the first to admit, Paul's troublesome to me. I've always found Paul's writing a little bit troublesome. It's just, Paul had his own battles. I am an apostle, and I'm going to prove it to you. Okay, that was a large part of who Paul was. I'm an apostle, just like you. I'm as good as you are, Peter. I'm as good as you are, John. And that, like it or not, that comes through in Paul's writings. And as Peter said, some of the stuff Paul writes is hard to understand. I find it extremely, it was one of the better things Peter ever wrote. Did you have something, Clark? No. Okay. So next week we're going to pick up with 1 John, and we're going to take a look at the 3 letters of John. You're going to get a break tonight. You're going to end 10 minutes early. But go ahead and take a look at the historical background. I think it's important. And Julie knows I kind of, if you don't understand the time in which it's written and to whom it's written, these books are not as impactful as they can be. So take a little bit of time trying to understand the background by what prompted John to write these 3 letters. Because if you don't understand the background, I don't think you understand what he's trying to say. So, questions or comments? Marshall, I'm going to let you go home early.